The night I heard crying coming from a dead woman's grave, I didn't run. I stood there, frozen in the middle of my uncle's wheat field, and I listened. Because something deep in my chest told me that whoever was weeping in the darkness wasn't a ghost. They were a victim, and nobody, not a single soul in that village, had bothered to care. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Shekhar. I grew up in the city, far from the kind of life where people plant seeds in the earth and watch the sky for rain. But every summer, without fail, I would find myself on a dusty train heading toward Priyatampur, a small village where my uncle Raghuvir lived with his wife Nandita and their daughter Deepa. That village, with its open fields and the smell of wet soil after rain, was the only place in the world where I ever felt truly at peace. Uncle Raghuvir was not a complicated man. He woke before the sun. He worked until the stars appeared. He loved his family quietly and fiercely, the way men of that generation did, not with words, but with calloused hands and an unspoken promise to always provide. Aunt Nandita was warmth itself, and Deepa, my little cousin, was the kind of child who made every room feel lighter just by walking into it. I arrived that year with sweets and gifts and the simple hunger of someone who had been away too long. The reunion was everything I'd hoped for. Laughter over dinner, old stories retold, the particular joy of belonging somewhere completely. But on the very first evening, as Uncle Raghuvir and I walked back from his fields in the fading light, I heard it. A sound. Low and broken, like someone weeping from a very deep place, not just with their throat, but with their whole being. A sound that had no business existing in an empty field at dusk. I stopped walking. "Did you hear that?" I asked. My uncle didn't even turn his head. "Don't worry about it," he said, his voice flat. "It's been happening for weeks. Nobody's there when you look. But someone is clearly." "Leave it, Shekhar." His tone closed the conversation like a door slamming shut. I let it go. But the sound followed me home, followed me to bed, followed me into my sleep. There was something in that crying that I couldn't explain, a quality of desperation so raw and so ancient that it settled in my chest like a stone. I lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling, and I made a decision that I knew, even then, was either brave or foolish. I was going to find out who was crying in those fields. The next evening, I waited until my uncle left for work. Then I walked back. The sun was bleeding out at the horizon, painting the fields in bruised shades of orange and purple. There was no one around. The only structure nearby was a small shed at the edge of the property, a storage hut, really, with a single dim bulb glowing through a crack in the door. I told myself it was nothing. I turned to leave. And then I heard it again. Closer this time. So close the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I forced myself to turn around slowly, and that's when I saw it, a dark shape at the corner of the hut. Not moving, not speaking. Just there. A silhouette that had no business existing in a place where I'd just confirmed there was nobody. I ran. I'm not ashamed to say it. I ran the entire way home, breathing like I'd been chased by something, because I couldn't tell whether I had or hadn't been. When I burst through the door, my uncle took one look at my face and said, "You went back to the fields, didn't you?" It wasn't a question. "There's something there," I said, gasping. I saw a shadow, a figure, right by the shed. He sat back in his chair, and something passed across his face. Not fear. Something heavier than fear. You have an imagination, Shekhar. Get some rest. That night, Deepak came to the sitting room carrying an old photo album she'd found while cleaning. She dropped it in Aunt Nandita's lap like a treasure, and the three of us began leafing through it together. Pictures from 20, 30 years ago, when my uncle was young and life had sharper edges. And then I turned a page and I stopped breathing. There was a face in one of the photographs. A young woman, maybe 19 or 20, dark-eyed and smiling at the camera with a kind of smile that belongs to someone who doesn't yet know what the world is capable of. And I knew that face. I had seen that face, standing in a dark field, draped in shadow, weeping. "Who is this?" I asked. The room changed temperature. Before Aunt Nandita could answer, the door opened and my uncle walked in. He took one look at the photograph in my hands and his expression shifted into something I had never seen on him before, a cold, controlled fury that made him look like a different man entirely. "Throw that away," he said quietly. "Today. I don't want to see that face in this house." He walked out without another word. Aunt Nandita waited until she was certain he was gone. Then she closed her eyes for a moment, as though bracing herself, and began to speak. The girl in the photograph was Malti, my uncle's younger sister. The family had lost their parents when Malti was still a teenager, and Raghuvir, already a grown man by then, had raised her himself. He'd been father and brother both. He'd given up his own early years to make sure she had hers. And then she fell in love. His name was Kishore. He was from the neighboring village, restless, charming in the way that certain dangerous men are charming before they show you who they really are. Malti came to her brother with stars in her eyes and told him everything. She thought he would understand. He didn't. "That man is nothing," my uncle had told her. "He will ruin you. You will not marry him. You will not see him again. You will forget he exists." He had arranged for a different marriage within the week, convinced that speed and authority were the same thing. He believed he was protecting her. He believed, the way fathers and brothers and village men often believe, that his anger was the same as love. Malti disappeared the next morning. She left with Kishore, and she never looked back. The village talked. People murmured and pointed and shook their heads. My uncle, a proud man who had sacrificed everything for his family's name, felt the weight of every whispered word like a physical blow. And so he did what wounded, proud men do when they don't know how to process grief. He replaced it with rage. He declared that Malti was dead to him. He locked the door of this house against her permanently, and he never spoke her name again. For years there was nothing. No news. No contact. Silence on both sides. Deep and unbroken. Until now. I lay in the dark that night with the photograph face down on the table beside me, and I thought about that woman in the field. The certainty settled into me slowly, the way cold water fills a vessel. Whoever was out there, whatever was out there, its face was the face of my missing aunt. The woman my uncle had thrown away like a broken thing. I went back the third night, alone, heart hammering. I stood at the edge of the field as darkness fell completely around me, and I spoke out loud into the emptiness. "If you're here," I said, "I'm not afraid of you. And I'm not like the others who ignored you. Tell me what happened. I want to help." The silence stretched. And then, slowly, so slowly that at first I thought I was imagining it. The shadow gathered itself at the edge of the shed and moved toward me. What I saw, I will not try to explain rationally. I don't think words exist for it. But I saw her face clearly in a flash of distant lightning, and it was exactly what I already knew it would be, Malti. My uncle's sister. Eyes full of a pain that had no end. She told me everything. She had married Kishore, and the charm had lasted approximately 3 months. After that came the drinking. After the drinking came the cruelty. He hit her. He degraded her. He turned her own love for him into a weapon to keep her compliant, because he knew she had nowhere to go. Her brother had shut that door, and she was too ashamed to knock on anyone else's. The village where they'd settled had eventually grown disgusted with Kishore's violence and driven him out. He'd moved them to a second village, dragging Malti with him, and the abuse had continued and worsened. One night, she told him she was done, that she would go to the police, that she would have him arrested, and she would not be afraid anymore. He'd wrapped his hands around her throat. He'd buried her in the one place he'd thought no one would ever look, the field belonging to her own brother. The brother who had turned his face away. The brother who had decided she did not exist. Kishore had known, with the cold precision of a man who studies his victims carefully, that Raghuvir would never search for what he'd already declared was lost. She was in the ground beneath the shed. She had been there for years, and her soul was still crying in that field because no one, not one single person who had loved her, had ever come looking. I walked back to the house with tears on my face and a plan forming in my mind that was so clear it frightened me. First, I went to the neighboring village alone. I asked about Kishore. People there remembered him, remembered the shouting from his house, the screaming, the night the Sarpanch had gone to confront him and he'd snarled at everyone and then simply left the next morning. They thought Malti had gone with him. No one had questioned it. No one had looked closely enough. The second village wasn't far. I found Kishore in a small hut at the edge of it, living the way guilty men live, small and quiet, and hoping that distance is the same as safety. I walked up to him, and I kept my voice very calm. "I'm looking for my aunt," I said. "Malti, your wife." His eyes changed immediately, a flicker of something animal and desperate. "She left me," he said. "We fought and she walked out. I don't know where she is." I nodded slowly, like I believed him. I thanked him and walked away. And then I went to the police station. But not to report him. Not yet. First, I went back to my uncle's house, and I sat across from Raghuvir at the kitchen table, and I told him everything. Every word Malti had said. Every detail of what Kishore had done. Every year she had spent suffering in a trap that had been built, partly, from the walls my uncle had constructed around her. I watched my uncle's face as I spoke. I watched the pride drain out of it. I watched the anger follow. I watched what was left, which was grief so large it had no shape. The grief of a man who has been given the bill for every mistake he made and discovers the total is something he will never finish paying. He wept. I had never seen him cry before. It was not a small thing to witness. "She was alone," he said. Just that. Over and over. She was alone. She was alone. "She's still here," I told him. "She's waiting for justice. And she's waiting for you." He looked up at me, and I saw the moment he made his decision. The next evening, my uncle and I drove to Kishore's hut together. I had spent the day in careful preparation, my phone recording. Two plainclothes constables positioned at the door on a tip I'd provided earlier. Men I'd spoken to quietly, men who had agreed to wait and listen before making a move. Kishore opened the door and went pale. Raghuvir stepped forward. Malti came back to me, he said, his voice controlled, deliberate. She came home, and she told me everything. Kishore shook his head, backing up. That's impossible. She can't have. She can't have what? My uncle asked. And Kishore, in his fear and his desperation and the fundamental stupidity of men who have lived too long with no consequences, said it. He said all of it, that she was dead, that he had killed her, that he had buried her in Raghuvir's own field because he'd known no one would look there. He said it with the horrible confidence of someone who believes the secret has already held for so long that it will hold forever. He did not see the phone in my uncle's shirt pocket. He did not hear the constables stepping through the doorway behind him. He did not understand, until the handcuffs were on his wrists, that the walls he had built from silence and distance and other people's grief had finally come down. We went back to the field that night, my uncle, my Aunt Nandita, Deepa, and me. Raghuvir called her name himself, his voice breaking on every syllable. And she came. I watched my uncle see his sister for the first time in years, what remained of her, standing at the edge of the light in that dark field. I don't know what he said to her. He walked toward her alone, and I looked away, because some conversations don't belong to witnesses. We found her remains where she had told me they would be, behind the shed, beneath 3 feet of earth, wrapped in the burlap that Kishore had thought would be her permanent silence. The funeral rites took 3 days. Raghuvir performed every ritual himself, with his own hands, refusing help. He owed her that much. He knew it. He did not try to explain it or excuse it or wrap it in anything other than what it was, a debt he could never fully repay, being paid anyway, one small act at a time. On the final night, as the last fire burned down to embers, I stood at the edge of the field one last time. The air was still. The darkness was the ordinary darkness of a village at midnight. No shadows that shouldn't be there, no sound that didn't belong. She was gone, truly gone this time. Not lost, not abandoned, not trapped in a field while the people who should have protected her looked the other way. Gone the way the dead are meant to go, with someone standing over their grave who finally said, I see you. I'm sorry. You were not forgotten. Kishore was convicted 14 months later. The recording, the exhumation, the medical evidence, the testimonies of 2 villages worth of people who had watched him hurt her and had not known how far it would go. He received a sentence that will keep him behind walls for the rest of his working life, and I felt nothing when I read the verdict. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not relief. Just a quiet, aching finality. Because the truth is, there was no clean victory here. A woman died in a field, alone and in terror, because 2 proud people decided their anger was more important than her safety. One of those people paid for it with his freedom. The other will spend the rest of his life paying for it in a currency that has no name. I think about Malti sometimes, on ordinary days when I'm doing ordinary things. I think about the 19-year-old in that photograph with the bright, unsuspecting smile. I think about what her life might have looked like if someone had loved her a little more wisely, a little more humbly, I hope she knows that someone eventually came looking. I hope wherever she went, that knowledge traveled with her. And I hope, for the sake of every person reading this, that you never wait for a ghost to tell you that the people you love need help right now, while they're still alive, while there is still time to make it different. Don't wait for the crying in the field. Go looking before it's too late.